They say if you don't study history, you're destined to repeat it.
Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Raya, and I'm the daughter.
And I'm Joe, and I'm the dad.
And we've been talking on this podcast about LGBTQ history and the military. Now, Dad, you were in the military. What did you do when you were in?
I worked for the Army Security Agency. We fed all of our stuff to NSA, National Security Agency. I copied Morse code.
Did copying that much code affect you?
No, it didn't affect me. Did it? Did it? Did it? Did it?
This is the third part in a three-part series talking about LGBTQ history. And this is really important because we can lose sight of the fact of how recent this all is.
They say if you don't study history, you're destined to repeat it. And I think that's true here. There's people out there right now that are trying to stop the LGBTQ movement. Mostly because of ignorance and not understanding at all what it's all about.
And I think even that term right there, the only real movement is a movement for equality, a movement to be treated as equal. And yet it's still so recent that people have looked at people that are gay or lesbian or transgender as if we have some sort of agenda, like we're out to destroy society. We're going to come. And that was for a long time, that we're going to come for your kids, or we're going to come and destroy the fabric of society. When have gay men ever been known to destroy fabric?
Exactly. What it really is it's just being correct. What we're trying to say about the LGBT community, and I am an ally. I am a strong ally. The reason I am is that what it says is we're not asking for you to accept something that isn't right. It is something that is known to be normal. It is proven to be normal. It is not only acceptable, it is a right as an American, as part of a free society. It isn't any different than something else out there, which I say all the time, as being left-handed.
Right?
No, left.
I think of friends of mine that have gotten married in interracial relationships and have had beautiful children. And yet there was a time, and there still are people right now that think, how unnatural is that? Well, I'll tell you what, when you see their children, it's not unnatural at all. They have such wonderful families. And it's a different issue. I never want to say that being LGBTQ and being a racial minority are the same things. They're different, but there are some similarities in that it's all, nothing is wrong with it. And yet some people in some times of history have thought, this is not okay. And all we're trying to do is help people, including ourselves, understand that that's wrong. It's mistaken. It's misguided.
It's not that, it's something that is just now coming out and something new. It has been from all time, from history back to the beginning of time. I am certain that 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 years ago, I bet there were people that were left-handed. I bet there were. It's not something that's abnormal.
Right, right.
It's a minority.
We have different language to talk about it now. We very much now, these days, think about orientation as a category. Now, back in other times, periods in history, you didn't necessarily think of your identity as who you were attracted to.
Correct.
You just were attracted to whomever you were attracted to and whatever. It didn't matter that much.
And it's been that way, I think, from the beginning of time with the indigenous people.
I mean, every society is different, so I don't ever want to group all societies together and say they all got it right and we got it completely wrong. Every society has been different of their views of things. But by and large, I think you're right.
When you look at the history in America, it's less than 100 years ago that they started taking a look at the LGBTQ community, but they only called it gay and lesbian. There was nothing else. In fact, they often just called it the homosexuals. And that was it. They didn't even say gay and lesbian. And the government really never tried to take any action about it or do anything about it until they acknowledged that it existed. That's when they decided to control it. That's when they decided to put restrictions on it. And in an earlier podcast, we talked about the Lavender Scare. That started in the 30s.
And we published that episode 2 weeks ago on November 4th.
A refresher, what happened with the Lavender Scare? It was a moral panic during the Cold War. Similar to the Red Scare that said all these people were communists. That was the Joe McCarthy era. They targeted LGBTQ individuals working in the U.S. government, and it was recorded in the belief that the gay and lesbian employees were susceptible to blackmail, and therefore they posed a security risk.
And we looked specifically at two individuals that pushed back, that stood up and said, this is wrong. Frank Kameny and Jamie Shoemaker, who said, we're sick of this.
Yes.
No more. And they really began what we think of as the LGBTQ rights movement going forward. We can trace, I mean, there are aspects that go well before them. And certainly we know things that are coming up that we'll be talking about here. But they were two of the first individuals that took a stand because they knew that gay is good,
Yes.
as Frank Kameny said.
And they basically lost their jobs. One was offered the job back and took it, but it was only after a tremendous amount of fighting legally. It was in 1963 by an executive order of President Eisenhower that he signed banning LGBTQ plus individuals from working in the federal government, and he labeled them as security risks. What was the impact? The executive order led to the dismissal of many hundreds, thousands of LGBTQ plus workers and further institutionalized discrimination and criminalization within the government. That was 1953. In 1953, it was still considered wrong. It was still considered not normal. It was considered a security risk. Can you imagine? And that was in my lifetime.
I know.
It's not that far.
It's not that long ago.
No.
This is a big deal.
Yes.
It's within living memory, and that affects us. It affects us a lot as things go on. We're grateful for how things have changed, but there's still a lot that really impacts us here still coming from this. And that very act that Eisenhower signed into order went on to color a massive leak that happened in the NSA in 1960. There were two NSA agents William Hamilton Martin, he was sometimes known as Ham, and Vernon F. Mitchell. On June 25th of 1960, they decided to hop a plane to Moscow. And when they landed, they did a big press release with all of the Soviet journalists. They defected and gave away all of the secrets that they knew. It was the biggest leak that had ever happened in the NSA until that point.
Well, that's where I came in. I joined the military in 1962. By the middle of 1963, I was already sent overseas doing my job, and we heard about Martin and Mitchell over and over and over. It was talked about continually, and what a serious and terrible thing this was, which it was. We all agree on that. But the biggest problem they felt was that it happened because they were gay. Now, we didn't know this at the time that it happened, but it was suspected that they were living a gay lifestyle. And that is why they were more likely to defect, because they were susceptible to blackmail from the Soviets.
Now, they weren't just called gay. They didn't just say they were living the gay lifestyle, which, again, even that word lifestyle, we don't talk about the straight lifestyle.
No, the left-handed lifestyle.
So the word that they actually used, or the phrase, was sex deviants. I've never even heard that term before. I've heard deviant. I've never even heard the word deviant. But they were called sex deviants. And the idea was, we all understand that homosexuals are bad. And so these two men that defected must have been sex deviants.
Yes.
And they defected to the Soviet Union so they could live their commie, sexual deviant lifestyle.
That is the kind of message that they told us over and over when we were in the military, working for NSA. Heard that many times. Many times.
That brings us to a next big event in our timeline. Came at the end of the decade. Now, of course, the end of the 60s, I always remember hearing about this as the time of civil rights. It was the time of Martin Luther King Jr., and the time of folk music, reminding people that the war was bad and we should love one another. And equality for all, justice for all. And in 1969, in June, there were a group of gay men and women and trans women and a whole group of LGBTQ individuals at a bar in New York, and I've been there. It was called Stonewall. There's a monument outside now that reminds us of what happens, because this is where the LGBTQ community right now looks as kind of our foundational moment. Up until that point, police could come in and raid gay bars because it was considered illegal to be gay. And these were known gay hideouts. So they would come busting in. And in 1969, they finally said, forget it. We've had enough. And they stood up to the cops and they created a riot.
It was a key milestone. Just to reiterate, we began the 30s with the Lavender Scare. Then we went to President Eisenhower's executive order. That was 1953. It took another 16 years to hit the next milestone.
Hi, I'm Monica Scarbin. You may have heard my voice before, and I'm back again. I love listening to the Transcendent podcasts, probably because I've been a guest speaker twice. I need to tell you, I've been listening to these podcasts for over 2 years now and have found them to be not only inspirational, but very informative and emotionally lifting to my spirits, especially when I'm not feeling very hot. Go to transcendent.com and look at the list that they've got. There are many different topics for you to listen to. Once you're on the webpage, check out supporting the group. It's as simple as spending $3 a month. I'm a supporter, and I'm glad to be a supporter. You can cancel at any time.
1969, the Stonewall Riots. 16 years between that executive order and the fact that people actually called public attention to the unacceptable situation.
And there's lots more to be said about that, but we talk about that generally in Pride Month. We
Yes.
come back to the story again and again and again, and we'll come back to this again. But we want to move on in our timeline to look at the big event that happened in 1973. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago a little bit in the Lavender Scare episode, because it really, even that piece led up to what happened in 1973.
1973 was even more key than any of the others.
The American Psychiatric Association finally removed homosexuality as a mental disorder from the DSM, which is the book that psychologists use and psychiatrists use to diagnose people that come into their office.
It normalized the situation from a credible source.
You have to do a diagnosis for insurance companies so that they will pay and provide the treatment and that sort of thing. And they said, there are other things that are going on. There can be anxiety, and there can be social pressures, and there can be the other things that LGBTQ individuals are dealing with. But homosexuality is not a mental disorder.
Finally becoming normalized by a credible organization was probably the biggest success that the LGBT community experienced at that point. And that really opened the doors. That was one of the most critical things that had happened in the entire history of LGBTQ rights.
It was probably the biggest thing that had happened right up until that point. But little did they know that an even bigger thing would be coming just 1 year later. That would be the year that I would be born.
What happened next was in the early 80s and through the 90s, some things came along that set us back a little bit. First of those was HIV, AIDS. So many people were then saying, see, yep, that is God telling you this is wrong. And that was a big deal. It was an epidemic as it started out. And those who were against the whole idea decided, now we have something we can hang our hat on. The AIDS epidemic devastated the LGBTQ community, particularly gay men. And then the federal government under President Reagan was criticized for its slow and inadequate response to the crisis. So activist groups like ACT UP emerged, pushing for more government funding for research, treatment, and public health programs relating to AIDS and HIV. And the epidemic also heightened public awareness and shifted the LGBTQ plus community toward a more political engagement. And that was a pretty big deal. It was terrible. Because of that, it moved us to finally having to do something in the military, because it was really becoming a problem there as well. Some people were being forced out of the military because they were suspected of being gay or lesbian.
That brings us to what happened in 1993, which we talked about last week in our episode, where we got to the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military. It was supposed to be a way to protect LGBTQ individuals. But as we discovered when Monica shared with us, it didn't really give the protection that everyone was hoping for.
In the beginning, they celebrated. Wow, this is great. Until they found out it wasn't so great.
Which meant that if you ever got too loud, if you ever got too proud, if you ever got too excited about your partner, you could still suffer the same repercussions right up until now.
Then you were kicked out of the military, you lost your retirement, and a whole lot more. It was a very difficult time.
Can you imagine if we had don't ask, don't tell about any other aspect of your life? You don't get to talk about your wife. You're married, but you better not tell, and you better not ask if somebody's married, because you might find out that they're secretly straight. Don't talk about your kids. You might find out that they actually have kids. Don't ask about anything in their lives. Can you imagine that?
Well,
yes, it sounded good on the surface, but what a stupid idea when it comes right down to it.
Of course. Yeah. But it was another milestone that was moving us in the direction to the 21st century. And the 21st century seems to me like, gee, it just happened yesterday. And yet, we're looking back at more than 20 years ago was the beginning of the 21st century. And that's when there was action that really started, that came along. 2004, and Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. That was a very big deal.
It sure was. I remember it very, very clearly. I remember at that time, I was firmly entrenched in the conservative church, and I believed that that was wrong, that this was something that, Massachusetts shouldn't be doing this, and yet a piece of me on the inside knew how excited I was for this because I knew I was hiding a secret. I didn't know what the secret was exactly, but I remember getting this news and trying to push down the excitement that I felt inside and how happy I was for everybody.
But the biggest impact of Massachusetts doing this was that this sparked a national conversation on marriage equality, with the issue eventually going to the Supreme Court, which is a very big deal.
It would take it about a decade to get from there. So it went to Massachusetts, and then another state, and another state, and another state. And one by one, the states were added. I think Iowa was one of those early ones, and there's a few others that came in there that eventually came to when it was overturned in 2015. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, because before that, there was a big event that came up in 2010 as the culture was finally waking up. Okay, well, Massachusetts has this all figured out and got together, and the rest of the country, certain states are looking and saying, well, we don't know how we think about this, but, well, maybe it's okay to at least be gay. We don't know about this whole marriage thing yet, but I guess it's okay if you are gay. Maybe that's not really hurting anyone. And so finally in 2010 is when President Obama finally signed into legislation the bill repealing the don't ask, don't tell policy. And finally, LGBTQ plus individuals could now serve openly in the military. And I have a friend who is dating her girlfriend now and was very out and active in the Navy. That couldn't have happened apart from the repealing of don't ask, don't tell. It was huge.
Then, just 3 years later, in a court case in front of the Supreme Court, the United States versus Windsor. In this landmark case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, they called it, that defined marriage as between a man and a woman was unconstitutional, which means then that the U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, it is constitutional to have 2 men or 2 women marry. It is. It's not unconstitutional. That was another huge step in the rights that we're working toward.
Big deal. It was a very, very big deal. And that led us to, and this is one that was a huge, huge thing for me, 2015. 2015, and I've never been able to say this quite right, Obergefell versus Hodges. I just know, am I saying that right, do you think?
I think so.
So,
and if you're not, somebody can write us and let us know.
It's Obergefell. And I've never gotten that close to the specific case here, but I certainly remember what happened. That finally the U.S. Supreme Court said same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, and it was legalized nationwide. It was in the space of a few weeks that I transitioned, that I had my birthday, and that it was all my very first Pride Month, and that was the time when same-sex marriage was finally legalized. It was, for me, it felt like that moment of the sun coming out, and flowers were all around, and everything was rainbows, and it was very exciting.
That is so picturesque.
It was really the most significant victory that we have had as a community.
But we're not done. There is more to accomplish. One more thing did happen, and that's just 4 years ago. In fact, it's really a little over 3 years ago. There was another case called Bostock versus Clayton County. The Supreme Court ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited employment discrimination based on sex, also applied to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. How about that?
I remember reading the ruling specifically. They said, anytime you are discriminating on the basis of gender identity, you're discriminating on the basis of gender.
Yes.
So if you say, this person we think is a man and should not be dressing like a woman, you are now, by definition, discriminating on the basis of gender. And that's not okay. And they really just, all they did was pull out the logic of what does gender mean? And they said, anytime you say somebody's gender presentation doesn't match what you think it should be, you are inherently discriminating against gender. And they were absolutely right.
So in just this short period of time, from the 1930s to the 2020s, 90 years, the LGBTQ community has gained a lot, but there's still more. The lesson for us in what you get out of this is that it's all moving in the right direction. I think you made the analogy earlier about marriage, intermarriages of people and the difference there and how that really has made so much headway in about the same period of time. Back in the 30s, that was certainly frowned upon, even in the 50s, but they've made a lot of progress. We've got more progress to make in the LGBTQ community, but it's on its way. We're not going back. That's the good news. We're going to continue moving forward, which is exciting. And the way you're going to know we're moving forward is that you're going to hear more about it right here on this podcast.
You sure will. We're grateful to have you coming back here week after week. Thank you for being here. We're trying to be your voice of positivity every Monday morning to give you ways that you can be a better ally and a better member of the LGBTQ community so that we can fight for our rights and make sure that we're treated the same as everyone else.
Because we are everyone else.
And with that,
we'll see you Monday.